Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session for the research funders and stakeholders on open research and data management policies and practices. Thank you, Susanna, for posting the Google Doc form. I'm Jeremy Gielan. I'm a senior advisor at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of this group. Some housekeeping. Susanna has posted the collaborative notes in the chat. I would ask you to please visit those notes to at least sign in on the attendance sheet that we've included there. And of course, feel welcome as the session progresses to provide input into those notes as you like. I should also mention that there's a translation service offered for this session. We have translation from English into Spanish. The session will take place in English. The presentations will be in English, but anybody who prefers to hear the discussion in Spanish can do so through the translation button. But I should also say that I've been told that there's also a function such that we can have translation from Spanish into English. And in that case, I would encourage everybody to just click on the interpretation button and select English in the case that you want to hear everything in English. And if you'd like to hear the session in Spanish, you can click on Spanish. And I'd also like to say then that anybody in the session who does have Spanish as a first language and would prefer to pose any questions in Spanish, please feel welcome to do so, since it can be interpreted. Coming from a bilingual country and a bilingual organization, I know that despite how proficient you might be in the second language, sometimes you just can't say what you want to say in the second language, and so therefore, please feel encouraged to speak in the language of your choice. Speaking of the presentations, we have a very excellent and packed agenda today. We'll start with a presentation by Kim Pruitt from the NIH and the National Library of Medicine, talking about managing data resources in the context of the resource lifecycle. We'll then move on to a presentation from Peter McPulton and Susanna Assunta Sansone from Oxford about data repository selection criteria. Following that, we'll move on to a presentation by Ian Ruskanovich from PLUS, talking about some work that his IG has been doing, the IG for data policy standardization, some work they've been doing in developing a research data policy framework. And then following Ian's presentation, I'll give a talk on some work that we're proposing to undertake in collaboration with Ian's group on funder-publisher policy alignment. But before we get into the presentations, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the Research Funders and Stakeholders IG. Like many interest groups, ours started as birds of a feather sessions. We had some BOFs at RDA 10, 11, and 12. We had our first IG meeting at RDA 13, and we had our second meeting at RDA 14 in Helsinki. The group chairs, in addition to myself, are David Carr from the Wellcome Trust, Yasushi Ogasaka from the Japan Science and Technology Agency, and Dina Paltu from the National Institutes of Health. And there are really two objectives to the group. The first is to provide a venue for funders and other stakeholders to bring forward issues for discussion with the broader RDA community. And the second objective is to develop deliverables useful to funders and ideally other members of the RDA community and research data ecosystem. And you'll see that these objectives are largely reflected in the agenda for today. We have some presentations about projects of real interest to funders and other stakeholders, and then my presentation will discuss a possible deliverable. To date, the interest group has really completed one deliverable, and that was a survey of current funder practices, benefits, and challenges in developing and implementing open research and RDM policy requirements. We presented those survey findings at RDA Helsinki. But without further ado, how about we just get right into the presentations. Kim, I wonder if you would be able to share your screen. Our first presentation is by Kim Pruitt, who is Chief Information Engineering of the Chief of the Information Engineering branch at 3 different organizations. So Kim, maybe I would leave it to you to give a very quick description of your role, since I don't miss some of the nuances there.
Thank you.
So please take it away.
Thank you. So can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see your slides.
Okay, good. That's the first hurdle. So yes, this complicated string here. So I'm in charge of a branch. This is a NIH specific term. So I manage the branch of production services within the National Center of Biotechnology Information, or NCBI, which is a division of the National Library of Medicine, NLM, which is an institute within the National Institutes of Health. And so I'm going to be presenting to you a topic that has been developed. If I can go to next slide. Oh dear. Let me put out my laser pointer, and there we go, next slide. So I'm going to be presenting to you a topic that's been developed through an NIH working group, the Metrics and Lifecycle work group. We're a working group that's helping NIH implement the NIH Data Science Strategic Plan. Our focus is on dynamically measuring data use, utility, and modification, and on employing explicit lifecycle, explicit evaluation, lifecycle sustainability, and sunsetting expectations for data resources. And on the screen are the other members of my working group. So I'd like to start with a simple definition, the distinction between a data lifecycle and a data resource lifecycle. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the late summer of 2020 released a new publication about lifecycle decisions for biomedical data. And they defined lifecycle states as the primary research and data management environment, or an active repository and platform where data may be acquired, curated, aggregated, accessed, and analyzed. And that platform is what I'm here to talk to you about today, the life cycles of these data repository platforms. So our working group took into consideration the NIH Strategic Plan for Data Science. Of course, that's the framework for our whole working group. We were informed by business resource lifecycle content, and also informed by the National Library of Medicine resource management experiences. NLM manages hundreds of intramural data resources. Some of them you may be familiar with: clinicaltrials.gov, BLAST, GenBank, PubMed, PMC, PubMed Central, and many more. The next steps for our working group are to connect lifecycle to metrics, and to understand what other communities are doing in this space. So here's a definition of a data resource lifecycle. There's an introductory step, a growth period, a maturity period, and a lot of people really stop there. They think about the data resource in this context. Introduction and growth is something that could be a 1, 2, 3 year period of time to really develop a new platform and expand that and get it fully adopted by research communities. Maturity phase of a data resource may be years. In the case of some of the resources that NCBI manages, it could be decades. But then there's a period of time where you may start to see a decline. That decline or disruption could happen for several different needs. It could be that the customer needs have changed, and so the people that are using this resource have different needs now, and this resource is not meeting their needs. It could be something less, very disruptive to some people, like the loss of funding. the retirement of a PI, if this is something that's managed by a laboratory and this is a public resource that other people are using and that PI retires, what happens to this resource? Or it could be simply that because funds were not continually invested in maintaining this resource, that the service and performance is degrading, and because of that degradation, people are no longer using it. And so I'm here to really talk to you today about what happens at this point when there's either a decline or disruption, and what is the decision point that's happening here. So when you start, when there is a disruption or a decline, there's basically, to simplify it, there's two different decisions that you can make. You can decide that it's time to get rid of this resource, this data resource, and what the terminology that we're using is sunsetting. Or you could decide to reinvest, modernize, replace, upgrade. And so we're calling this product extension. And so if you're extending the product, you might expect your usage stats to show and they go back up. So I want to break it down for you very quickly. So I've already sort of talked about that top line. If you start looking at usage metrics in the introductory period, you might expect them to be quite low because very few people are aware of this resource. In the growth period, you're actively marketing this and you really are looking for an increase, a nice steady rate of increase in the usage stats of your resource. In the maturity period, that usage may be stable or there may continue to be slow growth in the usage. And then this decline and disruption period, you may see a slow, gradual decline, or depending on what the disruption is, a precipitous in use of the resource. So what are the tactics that a resource manager uses in these different phases of a life cycle? So in the introductory period, you're looking for users to pilot your alpha or beta release of your new resource. You're looking for testing. You're doing interviews with these users. You're getting feedback. You're using as many strategies as you can during this introductory period to get feedback about, is this delivering value to you as a user of this resource? During the growth period, once you've had confirmation of some value here and you've refined what the resource is, during the growth period, you really engage in a more aggressive marketing campaign. And so you may be doing webinars, you may be marketing it at conferences, you're writing publications, you're really trying to get the word out to drive up usage of this resource. In the maturity phase, you're also doing marketing, but it may not be as aggressive as in this growth period. And you're also still enhancing the platform, but it's not as a rapid a rate as the enhancements that are happening in the introductory and growth period. When you enter this decline and disruption period, what are the tactics that you're looking at? So if it's really something that's a decline, not a dramatic disruption like a PI retires and just decides to take the service down, you're really looking heavily at usage analytics. You're looking at feedback. You're trying to engage with your customer base to understand, how have their needs changed? Why is this resource no longer meeting their needs? And then when you're in the decision point, you're thinking strategically about this information that you've gathered here to decide if you're going to resurrect the product by reinvesting in it, or if you're going to make a decision to sunset the product. Now, in the next several slides, I'm going to be talking to you about sort of this decision point and the types of evaluation that happens at that point in time. So there's sort of an SOP for evaluating a resource that we've developed. The first one is basic evaluation. Have you considered quantitative and qualitative factors and customer needs? And I'll go through that in further detail in the next slide. At this point, you're making a decision, an early decision, is any action needed? Maybe it's a very gradual decline and you decide, well, I'm just going to keep watching that. You're also trying to evaluate who might be impacted. And so you have to understand who your user base is. Are they physicians? Are they educators? Are they basic researchers? Who is it that's using your resource? And how will an action change impact them? And if you're making a decision, if you think that you're going to be making a decision towards sunsetting a resource, then you need to start talking about how or if data should be preserved. And so the National Academy's publication that I had on my earlier slide includes information about this. Should data be deaccessioned, and so therefore that data itself is no longer available publicly, or is there a long-term preservation status for this data? Maybe the last current version of it is archived on an FTP site, for example. The next step, once an action has been decided, is to justify that action, plan your communications around that action, and prepare for what happens after that action has been taken. So to go into a little bit more information about quantitative and qualitative factors, quantitative is on the left and qualitative is on the right. And so you have to evaluate the cost of continuing to maintain that resource, or if you're going to reinvest in it, what is the cost of that reinvestment? You need to evaluate usage and performance. And so these are objective measures. You know, how many people are accessing it? How many people are downloading the data? How many page views do you get? How many citations do you get if this resource has published papers? Relevance and value. So again, this is this delivering value to the research community? You need to have connections to that community in order to assess this. Are there any risks inherent with this? Is there you know, suddenly a security software problem that is critical and you have to make a sudden decision because of that security risk? You know, is there suddenly a data privacy risk that's happened? And so there is a risk assessment. You also determine if this resource is still aligned to the mission of the organization that is hosting it. Has this organization decided, you know, maybe this organization used to work, 90% of their work was on, I'm making this up, plant model organisms, and now they've shifted to human, and those plant data resources are no longer in alignment with the mission of the organization. And also, is this a unique service? And so this also goes to impact to the customer. Maybe somebody else is doing something very similar. Possibly they're doing it better, and then the impact to the customer is low because really they can continue to get this type of information from another source. I'm going to give you two examples from NLM's experience. You may not be really familiar with these. These are both genomics resources. Unigene was basically an early attempt to cluster short transcript sequences in order to define how many genes existed for an organism. And MapViewer was basically a genome annotation browser, an early generation genome annotation browser. And these were both resources that NCBI put out. And so over the course of time, we noticed that Unigene usage was in a slow, gradual but steady decline because sequencing technologies had changed radically. The relevance of this research, of this resource, was considered to now be low. MapViewer, the cost of maintaining it required a fair amount of manual effort, and so the cost was relatively high. We noticed that generally usage was low. There were competing things in the marketplace, and this was just failing to compete adequately. But the relevance, because of our data holdings, we considered to still be high. And so we made a decision to sunset one and to extend the other, basically rebranding it and building a new product to replace it. So here's the Unigene example. You know, there was a strong growth in usage early, and then a gradual decline. These gaps here are just a failure of our logging system to collect logs at those points in time. But we could annotate this kind of graph. And so we knew that early in, or mid 2008, and again early in 2010, there were significant updates in terms of sequencing technology, such that the community moved away from the original technology, the original type of data that was used in the Unigene platform, and started generating a different kind of data, thereby making Unigene really not relevant to the user community. We started to see a steep decline in the type of data submissions of the type of data used by Unigene, and we ultimately decided later than we should have to sunset this resource. The next step in the SOP is to justify this decision. And so this is a narrative that explains all of the factors that were considered the recommended outcomes. If there is a data preservation plan, what is that plan? What's the community impact? And start to form your communication plans. The development of a communication plan is a very important part of this. We have to identify the different kinds of stakeholders that are using this resource, develop messages aligned with the life cycle stage, aligned with the decision if a decision has been made. Outline when and how often to provide messages about this. Are you contacting specific user groups? Are you sending out widely broadcast messages? On what timeline and using what mechanism for communication. And throughout this, we're engaging with user communities and listening to feedback, so that we understand, fully what their input is to them, and providing information about other replacement resources that may be useful for them to use. The fourth point of the SOP is to prepare for post-decision. And so if you've decided to sunset a resource, you still need to have a point of contact for that resource, because questions may continue to come in over time. Maybe somebody hadn't heard about the decision to sunset it and they want to know, was data preserved? Where can I get it? Contact. You need to anticipate what kind of questions might come in, and again, have clarity on where and how the data is preserved. If you're reinvesting in it, you need to understand what your goals are, what value you're trying to add back to the user community, who's the lead, of course, on a redevelopment effort. And again, how will you engage in communities that you anticipate would be using this resource? And so, I hope I've left you with a strong message that, this community engagement, listening, planning, coming up with a roadmap once you've made a decision. Is a very important part of this process. And so I hope I didn't go over time, Jeremy. I wasn't really keeping track. But if there's time and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Kim, thank you so much. And in fact, you're right on time. So excellent timekeeping on your part. And yes, we do have maybe 5 minutes for questions. So I would invite people to either raise their hand by clicking on the participants or the hand function that's available in the participants list, I believe, or enter a question into chat.
So I can't see chat. I can if I stop sharing, but if you want me to keep my slides up, let me know.
No, I think you can stop sharing, Kim.
Okay.
Kim, maybe I'll start with a question.
Okay.
You emphasized and you mentioned the importance of stakeholder engagement in making these decisions and so on. In your experience and the repositories that you deal with, who would be the key stakeholders that you'd be reaching out to in these considerations?
Well, I mean, we do have different stakeholders for different repositories. Researchers are a major stakeholder for the repositories that we provide. But for clinicaltrials.gov, patient advocates, patients are another important stakeholder that we try to reach out to through patient advocacy groups. And so and through our literature, like if we're talking about PubMed and PubMed Central, then the publishers that submit the data are an important stakeholder, in addition to the research and medical community that are relying on the content of PubMed to support their work. And so per repository, you have to consider if you have a niche type of user that you need to be really connecting to. And sometimes it can be challenging to find these users and connect to them. And so the tactics in communicating can be very widespread. You may be part of a society. Maybe there's a society that you contact and try to engage with them. Maybe you try to do blog posts and webinars and do a more general broadcast, or even use social media. We don't use social media as a help desk, but we do use social media for outreach to let people know we're interested in connecting with you. Contact us here if you're interested in talking to us. And so we employ a broad variety of tactics to try to engage with different user communities.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for giving, presenting on that really important and interesting work that I think you're doing. And I think it should be helpful for people throughout the community to kind of examine this framework that you're developing and so on.
Thank you.
So the next presentation we have is by Peter McQuilton and Susanna Asanta Sansone from University of Oxford. So Susanna or Peter, would one of you like to share your screen?
Yeah, hello everyone. I will just do that now, bear with me. Okay, and I do that. What does that do for us? Nothing. Okay, now you should be able to see my slides. Can everyone see my slides?
Very good, yes.
Excellent. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So over the next 15-20 minutes or so, I'll talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing as part of the Fair Sharing Working Group on repository selection criteria. There we go, it's changing, good. So first of all, I'll give you a few introductory slides as to what we do in the Fair Sharing Working Group. So as you may be aware, our group is now in maintenance mode as we've completed our original 18-month lifespan. And during that time, you can see, as you can see my cursor, you can see we completed 2 outputs, which are now endorsed by the RDA. The first is the Fair Sharing Registry itself, which I'll briefly mention in a moment, and then a set of recommendations and guidelines for the users and producers of standards and repositories that describe how one can select and use them, alongside some advice for funders and publishers on how you can best recommend these resources in data policies. Since then, we've continued working in maintenance mode, as I say, and we're working on this data repository selection criteria work, which I'll present here, alongside a fair number of other FAIR enabling activities. And I'm not going to list them all here, but if you want to know more information about those, there's a link that I'll share later on in the presentation, or you can go to the Fair Sharing Working Group page on the RDA site, and you can see more about those. So what are we doing in the Fair Sharing Working Group? What are we doing all this for? Well, we're trying to turn fair into a reality. So that's a nice phrase, but practically, what does that mean? How can we do that? So we need tools and services, essentially, to foster a culture change to one where the use of standards and repositories is pervasive and seamless. And one way to get closer to this aim is to better surface all the information on the standards and repositories that are out there, what domains and disciplines they work in, and how they link or relate to each other, as you can see here. So we're doing this through the Fair Sharing Registry, which is one of this working group's outputs, and we provide manually curated, community-vetted metadata and knowledge graphs to represent the standards, repositories, and knowledge bases, and the data policies from funders, journals, and other organizations that endorse their use. So you can see here on the diagram, we've split standards into a number of different types. We describe them using a number of metadata fields and then describe the relationships between them, and then relate them back to the repositories that implement them and the data policies that endorse them. So to explain that in a little bit more detail very briefly, here's an example record on fair sharing. This one's for the Open Science Framework, or OSF. So you can see obviously every record has a name, an abbreviation, a lifecycle status, similar to what Kim was just talking about there, and then some handwritten prose at the top describing the record alongside some controlled vocabulary terms for the subjects that the record pertains to, the species and so on. If you were to scroll down the record, you'd see some of these relationships. So this database uses these particular models and formats and this particular identifier schema. And then these databases are related to it in some form. And if you were to scroll even further, you'll see also the data policies that recommend this repository. So here you can see there's a number of policies that recommend it. And if you were to click on those logos, it would then take you to their data policy and fair sharing. And you can see every record on fair sharing can be maintained by someone from the resource themselves. So here, in this case, this OSF record is maintained by 2 people from OSF, and also, as it's quite a complete record, it also has its own DOI, so you can cite this metadata. So in terms of how we work on the data policies with publishers, publishers can use fair sharing to select standards and repositories they recommend in their data policy, and also to discover new resources and monitor their evolution to refine and update those policies. So as new resources appear on fair sharing, they can see those, they can see that they're useful, add them to their policy. We also have a collaboration with the Centre for Open Science to classify these policies according to the top guidelines. So that's a brief introduction to our output from the working group as fair sharing. That's all I really wanted to say about it. These slides, I've added them as a link into the session notes, so you can read through this slide at your leisure. But essentially, what we're trying to do, both with fair sharing as an output and with the working group as a whole, is to guide the consumers of these resources to discover, select, and use them with confidence, and then to help the producers of these resources, including data policies as a resource, to make them more visible, more widely adopted and cited. And now I mentioned that I would give you a link where you can find out more about some of the fair enabling activities we're doing, and that link is shown at the bottom of this page, fairsharing.org/communities. And you can also see this is a little bit of advertising. We appear in a number of different policy documents, and we have a number of different adopters, many of which you can see on our working group page. And also, if you go to the RDA adopters page, there's a couple of videos from our adopters too. Okay, so that's kind of the work that we've done in the working group to date. Now it's the current work that we're doing, and that is understanding the needs of journal publishers. So in this paper, which you can see in the center of the screen, from 2019, which is only last year but feels a lot longer given the year we're living through, we analyzed all the data policies from journal publishers and also looked at the standards and repositories that they recommend. And we found that there's a lot of discrepancy in how they recommend standards and repositories and what they recommend. And we see that this is a disservice ultimately to authors when they're looking to publish their article and then put their data somewhere sustainable. We need to improve those data policies so that they're more consistent, and so ultimately they're more defensible to authors. And we think that we can do that in the Fair Sharing working group by working collaboratively to generate these consistent criteria and guidelines. And so that's what we're trying to do. And we've done that through a collaboration also with DataCite and a number of publishers that you can see down the right-hand side of the screen, to try and align their data policies using a structure and a framework of these criteria in relation to repositories to enable it to be more consistent. And you can see we've published all this as a preprint in Zenodo. So there's the link, but you'll see this link throughout the presentation. Now, we started this way back in 2018, and you can see on the screen there a number of the current members and the journal publishers that they're related to. And through a number of in-person meetings, remember those, and regular conference calls, we've worked through and generated these criteria. And then we've ran a number of community feedback surveys, and pleasantly, to date, these surveys have been both encouraging in that respondents were overwhelmingly positive about what we were doing, and constructive in that they've also suggested improvements. And these surveys were not only to data policymakers, but also importantly to repositories themselves and to other repository related initiatives such as Core Trust Seal. So as you can see from the notes at the bottom, we went through about 115 comments, written comments on the criteria, and we use those to refine, clarify, and improve them. So these criteria, I think I've probably covered most of this already, but the aim here for these criteria is to make all these data policies more consistent by allowing them to automatically select the repositories that meet the criteria. So you can identify them and select them to then add them automatically to a data policy. And you can do this using the underlying structure within fair sharing. So the next kind of aim of this is to curate all of these criteria into fair sharing as a registry itself, so that we can facilitate the real-time update of data policies. So when the metadata for a repository in fair sharing is updated and suddenly that repository doesn't meet the criteria for a particular journal, then it will fall out of that journal's data policy. And likewise, conversely, were it to suddenly meet the criteria, whereas prior it didn't, then it would be added to that data policy. And this would also all be automatic and defensible and transparent in terms of here are the criteria. If you meet these criteria, you will be added to this data policy. So those are the kind of positions that we're at now. Now, I'm sure you're all desperate to know what the criteria are. So here they are. There are 18 criteria. They're split into two levels. One is at the repository level and the other at the dataset level. And you can see them listed there. I won't go through them. But where appropriate, we've also mapped these to other initiatives, because the aim here is to complement all these other initiatives. And so we mapped them to the relevant trust principles and also the cultural seal requirements. And here's the table where you can see in a little bit more detail how we've mapped out those criteria. So obviously there's only 4 here, but you can see we define them, we specify how we're going to assess them using information in fair sharing, and then how this relates back to the publishers. And this is all working directly with the publishers to know exactly what they need. And this table in its entirety can be found in the preprints. So I realize I've kind of gone through that very quickly. So there will be time at the end for plenty of questions, but I just want to talk now about some of the challenges and future work for these criteria, because we're by no means finished. So the first is that we need to understand better licenses, so license equivalents. So many repositories don't use Creative Commons licenses for data sets, or indeed for the repository themselves. They sometimes use something that may be equivalent to that with a few alterations, or have an entirely different custom license. And it's very difficult in a machine actionable way to assess that and pass a judgment on that ultimately. And so this equivalence is difficult to measure and assess. And so this is something that we're going to need to grapple with. And then also, journal publishers wanted to know the file size that was allowed for particular repositories, and also the cost that may be associated with deposition to a particular repository, as that can inform whether a repository is suitable or not. And this is key information, but often it's not available in the repositories. You cannot find this information very, very easily, and therefore it's hard for fair sharing as a registry to curate that information. In addition, many people use institutional repositories, and these can vary in their accessibility, in their fairness, and in their criteria and other aspects. And it can be impractical to kind of identify all of them across the world, because some are very discrete and some are only available within an institute and not outside of an institute. But this is something that we might need to move towards, and perhaps use this criteria to select those institutional repositories that are rigorous enough to meet the criteria, so they can be added to data policies. And then there's also the kind of data set citation, so whether and how a repository follows the data citation principles, and whether they have enough metadata surrounding each data set within that repository. And this information, again, is very hard to find, with some repositories having very good data set metadata for some data sets in that repository, but not others. And so how can you assess that repository? Is it that it has the facility to allow people to capture good metadata, but it doesn't mandate it? And therefore, how would you assess that? And then also, finally, data usage metrics to assess the data usage. This is great, but often it's not technically possible for a repository to provide that information, and it may also be commercially sensitive in some cases, in which case they're not willing to provide that information, and understandably so. And so in terms of our work now, we have a few short and, if you like, midterm objectives. And it's important to state that what we're trying to do here is not provide an assessment of the overall quality of a repository, but to talk about the suitability of a repository for being, if ultimately endorsed by a data policy. However, if you have a good repository that doesn't quite meet those criteria, but which everyone uses and it should be endorsed, then that would still be endorsed by a data policy. It just wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria. So there is room around that. But our aim is really to use these criteria to guide journals and journal publishers to be able to provide authors with consistent guidance in terms of their data policies, and also to reduce the duplication of effort between different publishing houses where everyone has to create their own data policy. And they can vary wildly, as we've said. And the aim, therefore, is to promote that policy alignment, not only between journal publishers, but also funders, which is why we're looking forward to this session and also the previous session on the data policy implementation in relation to those repositories that are recommended and how they're recommended. And all of this should be transparent and fed back to the data repository developers and managers themselves, so that they can see the features that are believed or perceived by journal publishers to be important, and so they can understand if they wish to add those features or not, and to also apprise the other certification and evaluation initiatives such as Culture Seal to serve as a reference for them and to provide a different perspective. And then kind of more on our side internally in fair sharing to drive the curation of our data repository descriptions. So I'll just click on to the next one. Okay, so next steps right now. First one is to publish this work by expanding on the preprint. So the preprint gives you a nice overview, but there's more information we'd like to show, and also to start curating this information in fair sharing for at least 10 exemplar repositories, so that we can illustrate the criteria and how they work, and also kind of move it forward as a proof of concept. Alongside that, we're looking, in a sense, for more adopters. So we're going to have a signatory page, which will be set up just using the fair sharing website to allow involvement and collaboration in the group to other publishers and funders, to pilot more crowd curation and engagement, so to allow people to add their own data here for these sections, and to increase the number of collaborations and ultimately sharing of the information to make it more sustainable between different groups, and then to create more formal links between the fair sharing work group, the funders interest group, and the policy standardization interest group to help foster better data policy alignment. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. That was fascinating. And I'd like to open the floor now to questions. I see we have one hand raised by Kirsten. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I'm Kirsten Lehnert, and I'm actually co-chairing the Domain Repositories Group, and I'm also co-chairing the Council of Data Facilities in the US, specifically focusing on Earth Science repositories. And I was wondering, it seems that repositories were not involved at all in defining these criteria or providing feedback on feasibility and, you know, just a collaborative approach to this. And yeah, I'm interested why this hasn't been inclusive.
I understand your point, but maybe I wasn't clear in my talk, as obviously to define the criteria, we had to first of all get a number of journal data policymakers in the room to understand what they wanted, and then we published these to get community feedback. And as part of that, we did receive a lot of feedback from repositories, and using the information in fair sharing, we have contact details for hundreds of repositories, and we emailed all of them with the criteria and specifically asked for feedback, and many did provide feedback. So perhaps I wasn't clear on that, but also these criteria are kind of still open for comment. They will still evolve. And speaking as someone who works on a database, I certainly don't want to make anything or contribute to anything which is unrealistic. So please, if that was the understanding, I apologize for that misunderstanding. But also, if you do have any other comments, you can just contact us and let us know, and we can take those into account.
Sure, yeah, that would be great.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I see that there was one that came in while you were giving your presentation, Pete.
Oh, yeah.
It asks, can you comment on how the records are initiated in fair sharing and what curated versus community vetted means? For example, my particular repository ended up with erroneous information in its record, yet I was not able to correct as a relevant record maintainer.
Oh, that's interesting.
Likewise, if external stakeholders are unaware of the resource, how would they know to go endorse it?
Okay, so all data in fair sharing is manually curated by one of our curators. So every record is reviewed by someone internal to fair sharing. However, we may not be the domain experts for a particular domain, and we want to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible. So what we try to do is reach out to the resource maintainer themselves and ask them to actually maintain the record and ensure it's up to date and accurate. However, sometimes people don't want to do that, and they say, okay, look, I think it's great, I'll tell you what needs changing, but I don't want to be the maintainer. That would be an extra burden, I don't want to do it. So that's when it's community vetted rather than community curated or curated. And in this particular case, erroneous information in its record, obviously we can talk about that. I don't know how that information would have got there, whether that's one of our curators or whether if people make relationships between records, that can, sometimes those relationships can be incorrect. And I don't understand why you wouldn't be able to correct it. So something must have gone on there, but we can talk about that. And if external stakeholders are unaware of the resource, how would they know to go endorse it? If they're unaware of the resource, as in the particular resource record in fair sharing, that's part of what we're trying to do, to surface all of this information to make it more visible to people. So what I hadn't mentioned, because there wasn't time, is our metadata also goes to a number of different other tools, data management tools, and so on, to try and increase the fairness and visibility of all these resources. And that's also partly why I'm here, to try and encourage people to see all this information. But in terms of that particular issue with erroneous information, we can talk offline about that and get that fixed.
Okay. Two people raised their hands. I see that Kirsten, I don't know if you raised it again or if that's if you
No,
just still
that's,
have
sorry.
And then Danny, maybe you had something you wanted to say, and then we should really move on, I think, to Ian's presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much. This would be very quickly. So thanks, Peter, for answering those questions. If repositories, or if there are still stakeholders at large that want to comment on this, what's the best way to direct those comments? Where should those go? You said there's still the criteria is still open for comment. Could you
Yeah, so I'll put it in the best way, the quickest way is ultimately to email either myself or Susanna, and then we can bring that up in the next meeting with all of the publishers. We did have a Google form open, but I think that's probably now closed. So I think now the best way, and I'll add this into the minutes, is to contact us directly.
That'd be great. Thanks very much for that. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, thanks again, Peter and Susanna, for the excellent presentation, and for everyone who asked those questions. I think we'll move on now to Ian's presentation. Ian H., who is publisher of Open Research at PLUS. He's going to be talking about some work that the IG for Policy Standardization and Implementation has been doing. So thank you, Ian, for sharing your slides already.
Thank you. I'll get started right away. So I'm going to tell you briefly about the work of another interest group and also leading on to some potential collaborations with this group. Now, I wanted to start my talk, a little bit of context, and just to actually start it with a bit of data. And what's useful to know about research data policies is that researchers say that the requirements, the policies of publishers and of funders are somewhat, or if not quite motivating for them to share research data. So we know that they are a useful tool for affecting the goal that we all have in mind in terms of increased availability of data. And they're actually effective in practice as well. So this slide shows that at a number of journals published by publisher A, Biomed Central, and a number of journals published by publisher B, PLOS, shows that when those publishers' journals introduced a mandatory policy requiring sharing of data and availability of data availability statements, there was a marked increase in what we wanted to see: more data available, more data availability statements. That's important to think about why I think we spend so much time talking about policies. But there is an awful lot of change going on in the research data policy landscape, and has been for a number of years. And that change isn't specific to journals and isn't specific to funders. This is some data from 2 or 3 years ago now that Springer Nature kindly shared, that we've used in presentations before, and really seeks to illustrate that certainly not all funding agencies have policies on research data, but a significant minority of them do. But there are differences in the content and the requirements of the policies of those funding agencies that do have policies. And there has been a huge amount of activity and growth in the policy landscape, if you like, of journal publishers. So starting from 2016 onwards, there have been initiatives from most of the large publishers, Springer Nature, Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor & Francis, and others, to try to introduce some form of research data policy to all of their journals. And we're talking tens of thousands of journals. There have also been initiatives from societies, who are also often publishers, of course, such as the American Geophysical Union. Other groups, the Fair Data Principles, of course, we're all familiar with, and also the Center for Open Science have some requirements related to policy captured in the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines top. So overall, this is a good thing, but it does mean that we have multiple similar, overlapping, but not identical policies, and also lots of similar, but not always the same terminologies. Also, research communities are very diverse themselves. They have different levels of support available to them for data sharing. They have different needs with respect to sharing and reusing data. And all of this is quite likely to cause confusion for researchers who may be subject to different policy requirements from different stakeholders. And it's undoubtedly going to cause confusion for people who support researchers, like librarians, for example. So 3 or 4 years ago, this problem, or this emerging problem, was identified by a number of people within the RDA community, and we formed a group, the Data Policy Standardization and Implementation Interest Group, and we wanted to build on some activities that our own respective organizations had been working on, and bring that together to an initiative that could engage more of the community and globally. And so the objectives of our group are actually quite broad. We want to concern ourselves with research data policies of all stakeholders, and see potential in having common frameworks for research data policy for different stakeholders, be they publishers, funders, institutions, repositories, etc. We identified early on that a good place to start would be journal and publisher policies, partly because of so much activity in the last 4 or 5 years. And then what we aim to do is to produce guidance for creating, complying with and implementing research data policies, all, as I say, with that goal to increase adoption of policies, to increase sharing and availability of data. So what have we done for the last 4 years? We have been present at every Research Data Alliance plenary since 2016. And the main activity we have worked on is to develop a common framework for journal research data policies. We begun that and have continued with an open collaborative process. In 2017, we had calls with the community to gather requirements from different stakeholders. What would they expect to see in a research data policy? What are their needs with respect to research data policy? We made a draft of our framework available publicly, received 30 comments from more than 20 reviewers, subsequent discussion, further refinement at RDA plenary meetings in 2018 and 2019, eventually publishing a preprint and sharing that online on Figshare, and then real milestone this year, February 2020, we published our policy framework after peer review in the CoData Data Science Journal. So the main result of our activities, and it's a very, very long paper, so it's a shame, you know, if we're traveling on a plane, it might be something to keep one entertained for a few hours, but the main output is really this figure, this key figure. We have defined 14 features of journal research data policies. So that is the column on the left-hand side, 14 standard features of data policies, including topics such as definition of research data, what data is covered by the policy, data citation, data availability statements, peer review of research data. And the policies, of which there are 6 different types or tiers, they go from the first type of policy, which has the fewest requirements, going up to the 6th policy, which has the most requirements. And that is intentional to have a range of options that enables any journal, regardless of how advanced it is with its thinking and activities on data sharing, to enable any journal to pick a policy that at least enables them at a bare minimum to start a conversation with their community about data sharing. If that was their goal, they might pick the first policy, but also for journals and publishers that are more advanced and are perhaps wanting to increase the quality of the data that they're already publishing via their journals, then they might pick one of the more stringent or more advanced policies. I do want to make very clear that this framework, and that word's very important, framework, is it's not a standard that everyone must adapt. They don't have to completely change what they're doing if they already have a data policy. The idea is that it's a framework that can inform harmonization and implementation of policies. And indeed, if one were to look at the requirements of some of the existing publisher policies, you could see that they do map to the different levels of policies that we've defined in this framework. To give you one example of the kind of information that's included in the paper about our output is that we have a definition for each of those features, data repositories. We explain why it's included, and then wherever possible, we're evidence-based. We say, why is it a good idea to have a list of data repositories? Why is that meeting a need of researchers? Why is that beneficial? And then what we also provide, bottom half of the slide, we provide standard text so that if you're wanting to introduce a policy, there is copy and paste or editable, reusable copy that you can use for your policy to get started more quickly. It's worth noting that whatever your position on data policies, wherever you're planning to go, it's worth noting that introducing a new policy for a journal, but for any organization, can have costs associated with it, but there can also be benefits. With respect to journal policies, these have been studied somewhat in pieces of meta research. We do know that stronger policies with mandates, as I showed on one of my first slides, they increase data sharing and they help to ensure that data is available in the long term, but they do require more resources, more money sometimes to introduce. That's why, to reiterate, I think it's vital to understand what our researchers' expectations and needs with respect to policy, and then as an organization, be you a publisher or a funder, what are your objectives with that policy? Be they to start a conversation about an issue or really to affect change. I imagine many of us have heard this stat before, but I love repeating the fact that while there may be costs associated with these activities, they are also, or rather they're an investment in the opportunities afforded by fair data. Also, for anyone who is a researcher, there's recent evidence and previous evidence as well that sharing the data associated with published papers, which lots of these journal policies are trying to promote, can be beneficial to one's own reputation in terms of increased visibility and potentially citations of your work. So last slide from me. What impact have we had so far with this initiative? Well, quite a lot so far in the last 12 months. So very early adopters of the framework or users of the framework were Springer Nature's Scientific Data Journal, has a very, very strong policy, and all of PLOS's journals, which have a relatively strong, quite strong data policy. What those journals did was they updated some of the language using the framework to mention something that few journal policies have done so far, and that's language around data management plans, DMPs, which is of course important to funders and other stakeholders. Really important collaboration in terms of driving ahead with adoption and having much more impact with this initiative than our group could have alone is a collaboration with an Publishers Industry Association, the STM Association. They are using the framework to promote policy adoption amongst 150 or more publishers across thousands of journals. I've mentioned that we've published the framework, open access. It's already been cited 10 times, according to Google Scholar, but of course we all look at those numbers because they're the highest. But a really important milestone for us in June was that we've been recognized an RDA supported output, and we actually spent a lot of time in our session earlier on talking about the more interesting, detailed adoption stories. We had a presentation from Jana Stiebe, who explained how the framework had been used as a pilot to introduce or review policies on Slovenian scientific journals. There's also another paper published in Data Science Journal, where the framework has been used to assess the state of data policies in earth science and biodiversity in German language journals. And finally, leading us, I hope, onto the final presentation, is we have this emerging discussion of a potential collaboration with this funders interest group to explore the potential for policy alignment on certain elements between publishers and funders. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was fantastic. So, before moving on to my presentation on that potential collaboration with the Funders IG, we could entertain a few questions if anybody would like to raise their hand or put their question into chat. No?
Stunned silence.
Okay. I've already asked plenty of questions about your project, Ian, so I don't, nothing comes to mind just yet, so anything? Okay. Okay, one just came in. Do you know if anyone has taken on this to teach on policies from publishers?
So I'll if I'm not interpreting the question correctly, let me know. Oh, to researchers and PhD students. That's a very good question. I thought that perhaps, certainly publishers are using the framework to communicate and promote policy adoption with one another, and that's a key activity of the STM Association, who have a research data year at in 2020 and beyond. I would be curious. So it would be useful if any publishers that do have outreach programs and perhaps are talking with researchers and prospective authors about good practice around publication ethics. I do see that research data issues are becoming more common in those kinds of training programs. The extent to which this framework is being used, I haven't seen that yet, but certainly publishers and others are very welcome to use it. But yeah, it's a good idea, and it's not an impact I've seen yet.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here, and then I think we'll move on to the final presentation. So Michelle Barker writes, "It's very inspirational. Thanks, Ian. As we know, work on applying the FAIR principles to research software. It'll be good to use your work as an exemplar as to how we can achieve better coordination across publishers early on." So I guess more of a comment than a question, but an encouraging one.
Yeah, no, it does remind. I'm smiling as I say this because the amount of people I've had conversations with about when are we going to do this for software policies, or when are we going to do this for code policy, and we could debate about whether or not they're actually the same thing in a lot of contexts. But if you're not aware of it, there is a really interesting initiative called, I think, Code is Science, that is looking at compliance around code and software sharing. And they were present at their online event called the Eli Sprint a few weeks ago, and I was there. And I believe that some of those activities will need to look at approaches to policy on software and code. So I think there are some initiatives thinking about it, and I'm certainly interested to help out with them, but not necessarily lead that one this time.
Okay, great. So then with that, I think we'll move on to our final presentation, which will be given by me. Okay, so this is a potential project between the funders IG and the data policy standardization IG and implementation that Ian just presented on. This would be a project looking into policy alignment. The rationale, which I think other speakers have spoken about, funder and publisher policies influence and motivate data sharing by researchers. There's a need for policy alignment in order for research data policies to be maximally effective. Alignment between funders, I think that's pretty well recognized in the funder community. Also between publishers, and I think Ian's work attests to the fact that publishers recognize that they need alignment among themselves. But there's also a need for policy alignment between funders and publishers. And yet, comparatively little work has been done to examine funder-publisher policy alignment. So the objective of this project would be to first examine funder-publisher policy alignment, and secondly, to provide recommendations on how to improve that alignment. The possible initial areas of policy focus that we're considering are three: data management plans, data repositories, and data availability statements. But we'd be very interested to hear your views on what other things we could potentially look at in addition to or instead of any of those. The first step in the project is really project validation. So that's part of what we're doing today and throughout RDA is to hear reactions to the project and the kind of policy elements that we're proposing to investigate, but also hear any expressions of interest people might have to take part and suggestions on stakeholders to engage and so on. The project, as we're envisioning it currently, would consist in three phases. The first phase would be a research and analysis phase, and this would be research into the policy environment, investigation through literature review, and possibly surveys and interviews into funder and publisher policies. In this phase, we would conducted analysis of what we find, an analysis of alignment and misalignment in publisher policies and funder policies. And one thing we're considering doing is analyzing this alignment along the researcher workflow, recognizing that publishers and funders make their policy interventions often at different stages in the research lifecycle. So for example, DMP requirements are often at the beginning of the research project, whereas researchers are responding to, say, for example, repository requirements and deposit requirements often later on in the research project. It could be interesting to examine where funders and publishers are making their policy interventions along the research lifecycle. Following this analysis, we would develop a report on the findings, which would lead into phase 2, which would be developing recommendations to improve policy alignment between funders and publishers. So this phase would consist in stakeholder engagement to discuss the phase 1 findings and to discuss how from those findings we could develop a set of recommendations and how to do that. Within this phase, we would also be developing the recommendations. So, we would develop these draft recommendations on policy alignment for community review. And we're really envisioning an iterative process in developing them, where we would present drafts to the community. They would provide their feedback, and we would revise the recommendations based on their feedback. And then the end result would be that we finalize the recommendations. Phase 3 would be applying the recommendations, so disseminating them, but also exploring how the recommendations could be used as a basis for continued policy alignment between funders and publishers. So this could involve various initiatives or various actions, but for example, if feasible, we could look into piloting adoption and implementation of the recommendations. So, we're presenting this because we're interested in hearing feedback and suggestions on this proposed project. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about what we're envisioning and so on. But I've provided some questions to help foster the discussion, get it going. So for example, comments on the project or elements of the project plan, suggestions on stakeholders to engage, or even expressions of interest to participate. So I think I'm going to leave it to maybe David to field the questions here, since I might be a bit busy in responding to them.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. That brilliant presentation. So personally speaking, as a partner funder and co-chair of this group, I mean, I'm really excited by the prospect of taking forward this bit of work, building on the excellent work that Ian and his colleagues have done. I think there's tremendous scope for greater for funders and publishers to see how they can align to fulfill our shared objectives. But as Jeremy says, it would be great to hear from any of you. So please do raise your hand if you'd like to chip in or write a comment in the chat. Perhaps while we're waiting, I thought it might be worth just there was a good discussion earlier on the project. Jeremy and Ian might want to chip in on this from the policy standardization group. So Ian's group. I think there was pretty strong support there for taking this forward. You had a Swish Mentimeter thing. I think to remember it was about 20 votes in favour to two against. There were some really useful comments there. I thought probably particularly around, for example, around the. Well, I think there was a feeling that this was quite a challenging bit of work, but there was also some precedent in terms of work that the Belmont Forum, for example, have done in the past. So perhaps I'll just get quick comments from you two, and then I see we've got a question that's come in. So
I'll pass it on to Ian in case he has anything to add. Thank you, David. That's a great summary of what we presented earlier. I do note that there's 2 hands raised in the among the participants, which you have to click on participants to see. But
oh, sorry, I missed.
But before we get to them, Ian, is there anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I think we've probably heard enough of my voice. It looks like there's quite a few questions, so let's hear them, I think.
Yeah. Shall we go to Matt Lucas? Matt, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for this. This whole session has been really, really interesting, and I find this project really exciting. As I said when you presented this to the funders forum, as a funding agency talking about data management plans, we've been using the fact that the publishers have some certain data management requirements to not to justify, but to say, look, whether or not we come up with this, it's already there. But we've done that without really taking a close look at what those requirements actually are. So find the work of the interest group that has categorized those different policy requirements really, really useful. And so I think this next step of then looking at those policies against what funder requirements might be is extremely useful. And I also think it is going to be a real help to our research community that, as you pointed out, Ian, at different times has dealt with a real plethora of different approaches to data management. And I think it's been challenging for them to keep it straight. So the ability to both to categorize, and by categorizing, we're also by that very act simplifying things for the research community that has to look at that. And I think a lot of value will come to funders that will then perhaps help us to ourselves look where alignment possibilities for our own policies are possible, both with publishers and with other funders.
Fab. Thanks for that, Matt. Any response from Jeremy or Ian? Do you want to come back?
Just thanks, Matthew. I also think it's a good project, so I'm encouraged by your voice of support, and I think you're right with all the points you raised.
Can I just follow up really quickly? I guess I could ask Ian, have you seen any harmonization of publisher policies as a result of the categorization efforts that your group has done?
So harmonization between publishers. We've certainly seen a growing prevalence of publisher policies. I'm going to say a caveated yes, because I haven't explicitly measured, but what we do know is the policy framework is being used as a tool by the STM Association when they're reaching out to their members who are very new to this. They're saying, here is a tool for you to get started. And anecdotally, I have been emailed by publisher at Publisher X saying, we're thinking of doing this. I have a few questions. So yeah, early days, but I think, within months rather than years, well, that might be a more measurable impact for sure.
Great. Thanks, Ian. There's a question from Josh Brown in the chat. So he says, sounds like a great project. Is there any intent to work on making policy terms machine actionable? This would fit brilliantly with the work being done by, for example, Crossref and GIST to streamline the process of complying with policies. I don't know if either of you would like to have a go at that.
I thank you for the question. It's something I'd be very interested in considering, but I must confess I haven't given that particular angle much thought.
Yeah, it's. I think plans would be would be perhaps a little generous, but it certainly has come up as something that is possible as a result of standardization. Published papers often include lots of metadata. License information. It would be feasible if we have more common approaches to policies that this journal, this paper is published in a journal with this type of policy. So we certainly facilitate things become more machine readable, but not so much action yet. But certainly I think some of the capabilities of fair sharing also enable us to do more of that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. David O'Brien from the IDRC, I think, has a comment.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Jeremy and Ian. I have a question on, speaks perhaps to the rationale of this work. Having looked at a number of funders' policies, and ours included, they tend to be rather broad. I mean, that there are some principles and some aspirations that open data policies have. And I'm wondering, the policies, perhaps, Ian, that you've seen when they come to the publishers, which have created an obstacle to publishing their data in journals. I mean, most funders' policies state that, to the extent that data could be shared, it shall be shared. There might be some requirements on data management and privacy concerns, but there's nothing that I see that is very specific to publication and how to publish. So when I'm thinking about the integration between the flow, between what the funders are doing and adoption at the publisher side, where do you see the hiccups here? Like, what's the challenge?
I wanted to pick up on a bit of on another bit of your question, which was policies being quite broad, and I think that's probably true often. But in the UK, where I'm from, one of the reasons, this is where we have this sort of interesting circle. I don't know if it's a virtuous circle, but as publishers, we often say, well, the funders have policies, that's why we have policies, and then we've obviously heard the other way around. But going back a few years in the UK, there are 7 funding agencies called UKRI, and so within one of the physical science funders, they've had this requirement within the policy for data availability statements. So actually something that's very specific to how you write and share your research, and that has actually been one of the drivers for the much more consistent use of that feature of a policy. But I think to your other part of your question, and this is why I think it's been identified as an important piece in Jeremy's project plan, is that we need to think about the workflow. At what point are researchers reading and being subject to the requirements of this information, and therefore what practically does it mean for the design of a policy? We know that considerations around creating DMPs is at the acquisition of funding stage. We know that creation of these statements and often deposition is much later in that flow. So thinking about it in that life cycle, I think, is a really smart suggestion to include in the plan.
Okay, so it might be a little bit more about the implementation. I mean, I can well imagine the advantages of foreshadowing events to come once you've finished your DMP, and foreshadowing that there are data availability requirements of various funders and publishers, I should say, and making them aware of that. But so, okay, thank you very much. That was helpful.
And maybe I'll just add that you know, one element of something that we're considering looking into that really quite interests me is the repository element. I mean, it is true that I mean, a lot of policy requirements regarding repositories are at a very high level, and you know, might provide really maybe very few requirements at all with respect to what particular repository a researcher might have to deposit in. But I mean, sometimes, and I think I can envision this at CIHR, for example. I mean, you can have the very broad policy statement on repositories, and then for specific funding opportunities, you have a much more specific requirement for you know, the type of data that has to be deposited, or where and in what repository the data has to go. So I don't know if we would actually, you know, kind of really get into that type of granularity to such an extent in this project, but it is just from my own kind of interest in you know, looking at how, you know, my organization will move forward in implementing different types of requirements for deposit. It would be, you know, it's maybe a bit selfish to say, but it would be quite helpful to me to better understand what you know, what journals and publishers are requiring in this kind of domain of data deposit and repositories, and how that compares to what we could be requiring at CIHR, and what our kind of peer funders are also requiring in that domain. Okay, any other questions? I see we're just about at time. So unless there's anything else. Okay, I see no more hands. I see comments, but I don't know if any, yeah, I don't think there's anything, any questions. So anyway, I think it's time to close the session. Thank you all for attending. We will as I think, the co-chairs, and we'll regroup with Ian and his group to talk about how to move forward on this project. And, we'll reach out to group members, and, as well as folks who have signed up on the Google Sheet. If you're not a group member, I think we'd like to reach out to you with as this project goes forward, to see if you have any more insight and suggestions that you could give to us. So with that, we can close the session. So thank you for attending, everybody. Thank you, Yasushi and Dina and Dave. Have a nice evening, morning, afternoon, whatever it is where you're at. Take care. Thank you.